Hi, I'm James Dunn. Welcome to the Inside Network.
Welcome to INDepth, and my guest is David Brown, seasoned investment professional, currently between gigs. Welcome, David, to INDepth.
Thank you, James.
David, your career seems to speak for itself. You were a key part, obviously, of a very successful investment team at both the Queensland Investment Corporation and more recently, the Victorian Funds Management Corporation. Yet I understand in 2015 you were appointed as the Chief Investment Officer at the $5 billion private sector super fund in Papua New Guinea, the NASFUND. That seemed like a big shift in your career. What drove that decision?
Well, PNG is a fascinating country, 850 languages, 3 distinct ethnic groups, diverse, beautiful, and developing. Warm people, wonderful place in that sense. But look, I think, from my point of view, from a professional point of view, this is a country that has constrained or underdeveloped capital markets, a lot of private and direct investment. It's more Canadian than the Canadian model. There are no intermediaries, there are no fund managers, so you do it yourself. Professionally, very satisfying. You roll your sleeves up and you do it yourself. But quite sophisticated in many other ways. This is a large fund, NASFUND and the public sector fund, number one, you may have heard of. They are large pools of capital in a small economy. So the sort of complexity, the national importance of some of the projects and the companies that you own and manage are really quite interesting. So a delightful place from that point of view. And it's a workaholic's paradise. It's not a tropical holiday by any means. You're there to work. You're paid more than the locals, so you need to be able to impart some knowledge to the locals, mentor people. And I've been replaced by two of my mentors, two of the people I mentored, and that's been a delight to continue to work with them and help the country. So a delightful place.
It's interesting on that last point you mentioned, to help the country, because we have it's quite a strange relationship with Papua New Guinea, where we were the colonial occupier, or not occupier, but it was an Australian protectorate, or
yes, it was. It was technically part of Queensland for a while, but for most of its existence, it was a territory, like the Northern Territory, if you like. It was part of Australia. So a lot of the laws are directly out of Australia. The systems are out of Australia, and you'd be surprised how very, very similar it is. And so iconic. Our operating environment was that,
iconic to Australians for reasons of military history and our self-image and all of that. But I was about to say that the paradox of that, given the close relationship, is that I wouldn't imagine most Australians have a clue about what it is actually like on the ground in Papua New Guinea. Yeah,
I think that's sad. They're our closest neighbour. You can walk to Queensland at low tide. The border with the Torres Strait Islands was drawn in the sort of tidal mudflats, basically up close to the border. We're very close, and the people watch TV. They, Australian TV. If they've got the money, they send their kids to Australian schools. The schools there often have an Australian curriculum. They love our football. They love our beer. What's not to like? So we're joined at the hip. I think it's a brother-sister relationship. Big brother, little brother, and little brother's always a little bit perhaps looking for attention. The big brother just sort of seems to ignore them. I think that's a great sadness, and our press doesn't cover the country. When we do cover it, we cover the bad things. But there are a lot of good things and a lot of good Papua New Guineans who do some wonderful things, and they understand us. We don't understand them. I think that's a bit of a sadness.
Yes, I mean, you mentioned the press covers the bad things, and I was just about to say, I kind of get the feeling that myself, even though I'm quite interested in it, that we do see it as resources oriented, maybe slightly more interested in the resources than anything else in the country. And yet the other thing that pops up on our news is law and order on the streets, rascal gangs and even shenanigans in Parliament. So it doesn't seem that we do get much in the way of positive news coming from Papua New Guinea?
Well, it's certainly colourful, shall we say. And I used to think it was a bit like opera. It was, there were floodlights, there was makeup, there were rolling eyes and lots of drama. But when you cut it back to the business environment and you're working in a large super fund with corporates, it's very similar to here, and a little bit more colourful on the edges. And life goes on, if you like. We live in a very orderly country in Australia, so dealing with a lot of the issues that the vast swathe of humanity deals with on a daily basis is actually normal. We're the ones that are abnormal in the privileges that we have in this very lucky country. So it actually gave me a perspective. I remember sort of leaving the office at a lunchtime flight, wonderful, smiley, happy people, having fun, joking around, and I get back within a few hours and I'm stuck in the Coles car park with road rage around me in this rich Australia. And I could say there's something wrong with this equation here, and people with far less materially getting on with life and being happy. And that's a lot of angry, grey faces here in Australia. I'm thinking, well, come on, it gives you perspective.
Is it safe to go out in Port Moresby? Could you just wander around after work and go to a bar and a restaurant and a film? In
the precinct that we owned as a super fund, our clients were expats basically, and multinational companies and large local corporates. So we provide accommodation and office space and restaurants in a secure precinct. So yes, you do go out. You drive, you take some precautions, if you like, keep the doors locked, but you do stop for traffic lights. There are parts of Los Angeles you don't, so, I don't know that that's different from a lot of cities in the world. Sure, there's a crime rate and sure you have to be careful, but there's a way that life carries on.
So Queensland Investment Corporation and the VFMC, so that state-based superannuation sector, obviously you had a high level of expertise in that. So when the role came up in Papua New Guinea, what drove the decision to move across there? Because of or were the similarities what attracted you, or the differences?
Look, a little bit of both, and a little bit of the adventure, I guess. But I think, as I say, it's the illiquidity of their portfolio, because there's an undeveloped capital market, meant that there was a lot of direct equity. We owned the properties outright. We were large shareholders in some of the largest corporations in the country. So there was a corporate governance role to do, if you like. And on reflection, that was probably my largest contribution. The chairman of the competitor fund, I bumped into him after the news had got out that I was leaving, and he very kindly said to me, he didn't have to, but he said, "Oh, look, I think that's sort of the lasting legacy, your shareholder activism from the super funds, you're positive on the corporate governance in this country." And I was flattered by that and rather humbled. But we used to have a joke. There's a sort of an old gentleman's club, the Papua Club, with all the directors are members. And there was a joke that I would never get membership because they wouldn't accept me in there. And our chief executive, who was a member, I might add, he said, "Look, it's a badge of honour that they don't let you in. You're doing the right thing. You're stirring the pot." And this is an extremely complex and political Melanesian society. I was the one foreigner, if you like, in the organisation. It was an honour to be part of that, but you have to be very diplomatic. You're a guest in their country. That's how they do things. There's a degree of flexibility there, and it teaches you humility and diplomacy. But it's like walking into a set of a Game of Thrones. It's like Machiavelli and Shinju, the art of war. You need to know off by heart. It's eyes in the back of your head. It's exhausting, but extremely interesting. And I'd almost recommend it to any Australian to really hone up your skills of I wouldn't say survival, but to be able to thrive as a foreigner in somebody else's country in that complex environment teaches you resilience, flexibility, and a lot of other interesting skills as well.
When you say Machiavellian and Game of Thrones-esque, what are the main currents swirling around? Are we talking clan, tribe, family, ethnicity?
Yeah, all of that. All of that. It's a complex society. As
Class?
I say, oh yes, very much so. And there's education, if you like, and those who've been educated abroad, and those who are there, and a rapidly changing society. And the indigenous societies are quite beautiful, but rapidly disappearing before our eyes. I remember National Day where we got to dress up in our tribal outfit. I wore my kilt, and they were fascinated by that. And they asked, what do you wear under the kilt? And I said, well, what do you wear under your lap? I said, it's exactly the same. This is my tribal outfit. So, but equally, one of the housemary, the ladies who come and iron your clothes, which is a delight. My wife said, if I'm not having a housemary in Melbourne, you're not having one in Port Moresby. And so I ironed my clothes for many years. And but one of my neighbours said, look, he asked, oh, what's up for the weekend? And she said, there's a bride price. And a bride price ceremony is something very traditional. And he said, oh, that'll be wonderful. And she says, no, in the old days it was great. Now people bring a slab of beer and a boombox. So here was this young woman who, in her short lifetime, her own culture was disappearing. And there's this stress with modernism and the modern world, which they're all rushing towards. And they're actually losing some of the nice things of their society. So I think that's sad, but it's also geopolitical. This is an island of gold and silver floating on a lake of oil and gas. So you have every important nation in the world jockeying for position. And Australia by no means, and Australia has a lot of advantages in that relationship, but Australia needs to be very careful about our closest neighbour and of great strategic importance. We can't mess up that relationship. And, we have some advantages, don't lose them. A lot of other people are eyeing that space.
Because money talks ultimately, and particularly when you mentioned the resource blessing that Papua New Guinea, the endowment that it's got, money talks in that industry and has for a long time.
And they're very sophisticated politicians. Don't in any way underestimate these ancient societies and the subtlety and the nuance. It might be a new country, but they understand politics and they understand money. So what's not to like about that? and is that any different from Collins Street or Bly Street?
Tell us a bit about the superannuation sector there. Is it set up on Australian lines? Or how does the fund or the funds, where does the money come from or channeled to them?
Sure, there's a pretty good contribution rate. So in a sense, they're better than us in that way. They have representative boards, much the same way we do, but there are independents forced on it, so that their debate is sort of, there's bits and pieces where they're similar and slightly different. But by and large, it works the same. We had one fund which declared a crediting rate every year, so there was no fund of choice, and that was considered to be sensible in that environment. Our members, 150,000 members, typically large multinationals or large local corporations. So they were skilled and educated people, a middle class, if you like. And they that really put upon us a sort of messaging to members had to be fairly sophisticated as a result of that. They fully understood it. And in an environment where people are not trusting of institutions, we had to be a paragon of integrity and transparency, very well regulated by their central bank, and the oversight from the regulator was a blessing. It liberated us to do our job in an environment where there are so many other dangers of corruption and so forth. It was a near and present danger. I found in a crisis, the boards in Papua New Guinea actually know what to do. It's not a rehearsal, it's real life. So pleasant surprise in terms of the sophistication of and the ability to adjust to circumstances.
How much bigger were the public sector funds in Papua New Guinea compared to yours? Was, I understand, a $5 billion fund. So where in the totem pole of size of funds did you rank?
Look, about the same. There were two equal. So number one, and a great brand to name by number one. It's sort of, it means number one, the first choice, if you like. So made us the number two. So, but no one ever said that. But look, they're very similar in size, and we work quite closely together in many ways. But we're competitors. Competition is alive and well, as you can imagine, and we're all Australians or Kiwis and the Papua New Guineans were in the same space. A great pleasure was working with some of the other Pacific Island super funds. So we had investments in Fiji and Samoa and places, and we worked together as a Pacific nation sovereign group, if you like, national provident funds and super funds. And once again, they were big funds within small economies. Fascinating and quite good to work in fellowship with other Pacific nations.
What perspective did that give you on the geopolitical machinations of China and other countries, but predominantly China's the one that everyone's worried about, with its reach and its determination to establish itself as the hegemon?
Yeah, look, it's very alive and real, and it's across the Pacific and pervasive. Once again, money talks, and I think we would be foolish to ignore that. But we have enormous advantages. We have a shared common heritage with all of those countries, and we're brothers. We all go to the same universities, and we get on. We like the same sports, and like so we do have some advantages, but don't underestimate that money does talk. But look, we did work with organisations from those places. You need a long spoon, and you need to be very careful about governance and contractual obligations, because the way of doing business is a little bit different. But there's nothing to be frightened. You embrace that and you work with it.
So tell us a bit about your fund in terms of its objectives and stakeholders and just, I suppose, the way it orients itself and conducts itself compared to the Australian funds you'd worked with.
Look, similar in the way that the Australian funds work. And as I say, I was able to push corporate governance and shareholder activism with the companies there. Once again, a very similar story to here. But the stakeholders, as I say, the members, the unions, the government, the regulator, but you're a large pool of funds. So you're dealing with often, say, the government or supranationals, for example. We talked to, a supranational organisation about doing a triple P to build a headquarters for them. That was an interesting process, dealing with the bureaucracy in some the other side of the world.
Geneva or somewhere.
That's, well, yeah, one of those. I don't really want to name them, but anyone who's done any kind of government work here knows those bureaucracies and the length of time to get those projects off the drawing board. I think partnering with good quality local firms was really valuable as well. And super funds can't do it all themselves. You've got to partner, but partner in a way that you're not just lazy, easy money, that you actually know that you're bringing something to the table. And reorienting that sense of themselves as a super fund as being important rather than taking was part of the process. A very good board at that level, but like all investment committees everywhere in the world that I've worked with, you need to be able to focus your time on where's important, where's going to add value. There are always investments for all sorts of reasons that grab the imagination. Either they're glamorous or they're more usually problem assets, and it can suck up time. So, and when you have direct assets, I'm not always, I see Australian super funds rushing headlong into this space. But when you have an established portfolio of direct assets, corporate issues percolate up out of that legacy, and you'd be surprised. There's no such thing as fire and forget. It is a very active way of investing that requires a lot of resources and time. And if you're not careful, it will chew up board time. So like any investment committee, any board of any super fund, even in this country, focusing attention and the tools required to give them the right information in a regulated industry, but also to provide focus on where would be best to value add was a key part of the role.
So what shape was the fund in when you arrived? Investment-wise, governance-wise, and morale-wise?
Yeah, look, there were a lot of, say, long-term legacy assets where those problems, it was an established portfolio, if you like, and, shareholders agreements that had been negotiated perhaps by the vendor rather than by the purchaser, relationships where we were not getting audited accounts, or we were certainly not getting a dividend, and we were having no say in their capital expenditure policy. So one of the features of superannuation in PNG is that you can withdraw money for housing advances or for long-term unemployment. So liquidity was quite important for us, particularly when we had illiquid assets. Thankfully, many of the assets yielded quite handsome yields. We had 7.5% net yield off our quality real estate portfolio, 6% off government paper. But focusing on those companies that weren't paying dividend or were doing corporate activities that reduced the revenue to us was important.
So what was your team like? Did you have access to all the kind of systems and research and expertise that a similar role in Australia would have?
Look, the education level is actually fairly good. I had a young bloke who had a finance degree from a US university, a woman with a postgraduate degree from the UK and a university from New Zealand, and had been to school in Australia. So, the education levels are every bit as good as here. I actually tried to work with some of the super funds back here and in New Zealand, getting some, I'd love to arrange some internships, because where they lacked was perhaps the experience. In terms of systems and access to consultants, just the same as here. But what we found was a consultant in Singapore or Australia often didn't understand the practical execution difficulties of working in a developing country. So you sort of had to interpret or ask the right question of the consultant and frame it correctly.
So what were some of the non-investment issues, the major non-investment issues that you faced in that role?
Often quite basic issues like interrupted power or interrupted internet. So we were used to having a phone call and the phone just drops out, and then you just dial back and you carry on the conversation as if nothing's happened. You don't even say sorry, because that would waste time. It happens so frequently. Or the generators would kick in and the lights go out and then they go up again. The aircon goes back on. But it was, on a serious note, we had a huge bill for diesel to run the generators in the buildings. We had a 20-story office building with the United Nations in it and several law firms, and the interrupted power was wrecking their machines, their electronic equipment. So we spent millions on rotary UPSs to try to fix that, to clean up that power. We had a program to put on solar on some of the roofs to try to supplement emergency power. But once again, there was, the government put in place regulations to favour alternative energy sources, and yet their state-owned enterprise had a 99% dividend policy, so had to raise the revenue. And we were one of the best clients they had. We're a large landlord in town. We actually paid our electricity bills. So, we had a lot of passive resistance from from the state-owned electricity companies. Sure, we'll help you put solar on the roof, and the project's still underway. So I learned from that there are no bad people, they're just bad systems. And I found people from Australia would come and say, why doesn't that happen? I go, there's always a reason. Let's unpeel this onion a little bit. You need a little bit of humility to set back a little bit, listen to what's actually going on. And quite capable people are forced into situations to make a choice between worse and worser as opposed to good or bad.
And I think what all this has been leading to, David, is just the most amazing part of the experience for anyone reading the story is that the Chief Investment Officer of NASFUND manages to get arrested for conducting due diligence on a major investment of the fund, which yep. just would, it mystifies people who read the story. So how does that situation arise?
Well, it was clearly a tactic. We hadn't had audit accounts for several years, and it was clearly a tactic to avoid that, and a very effective tactic, I might add. Our auditors actually refused to write to them to confirm how many units we had in the vehicle. So then there are knock-on valuation issues. And you know, it wasn't about me, it was about my boss. I worked for some very prominent Papua New Guineans. And you never attack the guy head on, you attack the expendable expat, you know. So there are a lot of funny stories that I can tell you over a beer, hilarious stories. But the net result was, I was technically arrested, yes, but I was in a very well-run and orderly watch house for a couple of hours until they posted bail, which is a very modest amount. We went actually to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court judge in wig and outfit, it was like Rumpole of the Bailey, said, well, quite frankly, I can't see anything illegal in this charge, so there are no conditions on his bail. I was free to come and go. I worked the entire time, and I had 110% support from my board, and a lot of locals who came to me and said, you're not the first person to go to be arrested for doing the right thing in this country. It almost became a badge of honor, a club I joined, an imprimatur of my integrity. So it's not understood in this country, and but look, they're stressful. Obviously, it's stressful for my family, but not entirely all bad either. If that sounds too philosophical, but I actually saw what the locals live with all the time. They labour under the affliction of corruption and on all sorts of levels. And I feel for them for that. And there are lots of people in other countries who suffer that as well. Once again, we are the exception in Australia. We're in a lucky country. We don't suffer that. So but it gives you humility.
You mentioned before that a badge of honour was that you wouldn't be nominated or accepted to the Papua Club for membership, but being arrested is a whole other level. That's like getting a bar to your Victoria Cross. So does that kind of then bring about, you almost have to accept that happened, and it can then show all of the people you worked for and all of the people in that industry how far there is to go for them in terms of becoming a properly ordered system and society?
Behind the scenes, I think an awful lot of things have happened as a result of it. And it really has to do with the strength of regulation in the securities industry. So the securities regulator there were political issues going on. And I know many of the people who are part of that from a government point of view, and I think they were concerned about that. The super industry is very well regulated, and you could see the clash of the legitimate business of the Papua New Guinean superannuation industry, and then the somewhat difficult business of securities regulation. So yes, that happened. And I would say I had more invitations to lunch at the Papua Club afterwards. You know, crisis, never waste a good crisis. And I think PNG teaches you that. You roll with the punches. Many of my personal relationships were repaired It's a small town. If you hold grudges, there aren't many people to talk to after all. But I think there were one or two that were hard to repair. But mostly, I think good came out of it. I can say that with a bit of distance now.
So was it a real watershed in the sense of people hearing that and reading that and coming to a realization that we can't be a Wild West like this. Things have to change?
I'm not sure it's a watershed. I would say it's a gradual sort of process. And it's an extremely complex country. And a lot of things happen from this direction, and then you try to think about it. That's why it's happened. So nothing. It is a series of competing agendas in a very complex politics. So it's just not as simple as to say there's a watershed. No, it's way more nuanced and subtle to say that.
Is it different, David, in the sense that almost in the way things operate, more of a London than a Canberra, because we at least in Australia have the political quarantined in a city away from the financial, but Moresby is like a London. Everything's together.
No, I actually felt that Moresby was a love child of Canberra. Even the road system seemed to be like Canberra. It's very Australian, and anyone who's worked in the Australian public service understands the politics that goes on there. No, I actually think it's more of a Canberra. And I think, the Canberra political culture met Melanesian culture and made a beautiful marriage and a very effective Game of Thrones environment. But what you're talking about is the separation between, Main Street and the party politics. I'm not talking about party politics. I'm talking about economic interests. And I would say that the people who orchestrated my arrest were not Papua New Guineans. They were expats. They're from other countries. They exploited a loophole very effectively. So, golly, you've got a small country where a lot of people from other countries are fighting over economic resources. You have greed, love, all's fair in love and war, and you see it in a smaller environment. So you bump into them in the supermarket, so in close proximity. In that sense, it's much more like Canberra. It's a smaller town where you're actually physically close to them and probably socially mix with them.
Would you say that
your enemies close?
Would you say that in Australia you could cross people in a similar way as to what happened to you in Papua New Guinea, but their methods of getting to you would be different?
Oh yes, I think PNG is, as I say, it's like an opera. Everything's in high relief and highly stylized, so it's a little bit more mundane here. But I wouldn't say that in essence it's different. People are people, and money is money, and never stand between them. And unfortunately, in our role, and what we do professionally, and I think anybody who answers up to a board understands that. Life is political. It's just how you recognise it. And I think also that could be a Sydney and Melbourne story as well. I mean, the politics between Sydney and Melbourne are a little bit different. Somebody once told me in Melbourne, the difference is you can't see who stabbed you in the back. So, it's cynical, but it's sad. It's how do you keep integrity in that environment? How do you move forward? Or do you just sit still and be frightened and make no progress?
You're being modest, because I get the feeling that your legacy, as you alluded to earlier, after all of this in Port Moresby, is probably a greater emphasis on honesty and more upfront ways of doing things and the right things in terms of stewardship of money. So has that in a sense been a good outcome of technically having an inverted commas arrest on your record and the stress that your family had, etc. You've having come through it, as your rival super fund leader said to you, you really, what happened to you changed things for the better.
Yeah, that would be nice if that's the case, and if that's a lasting legacy, that would be a delight for me. And hopefully that's the case. I think at the end of the day, life moves on for everybody, and what happens to a lot of people forces change. There's a gathering pace, and I'm hoping that's the case.
Excellent, and hopefully there's a major new role on the horizon in Australia very soon, David.
Thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure speaking to David Brown on INDepth. Thank you, David. This has been INDepth, brought to you by the Inside Network.
Thanks, James.